So last time we were talking about the system of slavery during the period prior to the Mexican-American War, because that war actually is a pretty good dividing point in what slavery would be, when slavery would become a truly national issue. But it metamorphosed throughout this entire period. And where we left off, we were talking about slave resistance and all that kind of stuff, but minor acts of rebellion. Things like slaves purposefully not working as hard as the slave masters wanted, and escapees, destroying tools, maroons, all of that kind of stuff. And so that was leading towards this. Slave rebellions. So there were slave rebellions pretty much as long as you can, as many times as slavery became a major system, there would be slave revolts. For instance, during the Roman Empire, there were 3 major servile wars. Far greater rebellions than anything that happened in the United States. In fact, one of them, you guys probably know the movie Spartacus, is the Second Servile War. So these were common throughout any time that there is slavery, but of course, as time goes on and slavery perpetuates itself, slave masters become better at keeping their slaves under the lash and indoctrinating them into making sure that they don't want to revolt, right? But even prior to the United States forming, there were several major rebellions. There were a couple of rebellions in New York, for instance, where New York had actually been a pretty major slave trading capital. For instance, Alexander Hamilton was married to the Seymours, and the Seymours were some of the biggest slave traders in the colonies at the time. And he continued to actually benefit from that business. There's a question as to whether or not he ever owned a slave himself, but his wife certainly did. And but there's weird things in terms of coverture that basically, as soon as a woman is married, all of her property is then necessarily her husband's property. But she had sold her slaves prior to the marriage. So there's a question on all that. Well, she hadn't. He had, actually. So this was a system that was deeply baked into even the North. And of course, there were a couple major rebellions during that period. There was also a major rebellion in South Carolina. So there were already systems in place to patrol and keep any kind of rebellion from happening. But that wasn't exactly the case in New Orleans. When New Orleans was bought in 1803, it was actually because the French were having no luck in conquering Haiti at the time. Haiti was perhaps the only successful slave revolt in history. And, of course, this kind of freaked out everyone in the United States. And the newly acquired New Orleans was printing news about this constantly, especially when, in 1804, the Haitians turned to massacring Frenchmen in retaliation for slavery. And this was actually a pretty effective genocide. the island was pretty much ridden of French people immediately. And so a lot of these refugees who were fleeing the massacres came to New Orleans where they would be welcome. And this, of course, meant that everyone there was deeply steeped in this fear-mongering. And some slaves were actually pretty literate. They were pretty culturally savvy, especially in New Orleans, where it was pretty easy to intermingle as a slave amongst urban slaves, freedmen, mulattoes. There was an entire racial caste that allowed pretty easy mobility for people who just wanted to go and get a drink or something along those lines. Problem there is that they get steeped in this fear-mongering and they get an idea. And so this continued, especially from after 1804, but also the fact that the transatlantic slave trade was being closed at the same time in 1808. Suddenly, people who were hoping to find their relatives that might be transported or something along those lines were realizing they were stuck. And so a group of people who had survived the transatlantic slave trade started getting together in a region just north of New Orleans called the German Coast. And they formed the largest slave revolt in American history. These guys attempted to basically take over New Orleans. Estimates in terms of their numbers range from 200 to 800, but imagine when you're just a bunch of plantation owners and that used to a patrician lifestyle suddenly being faced with hundreds of slaves coming to kill you and having been steeped in all of this fear-mongering about Haiti and all that. So, of course, it called in the army. The army actually went in the wrong direction because the slaves were smarter than the army, and the army basically went off into the marshes, and the slaves ended up being taken on by a militia unit and killed or captured. Just basically, they had the slaves didn't have horses, the slave masters did. Technology, and they had farm implements, few guns, but the slave masters had sabers. So they killed or captured most of the slaves, sent the ones that could be good, still be good workers, and executed the ones that weren't, and actually held many of their heads on pikes around New Orleans for years to come. So this had a cooling effect on any further possible rebellions throughout the U.S. But that didn't mean that there weren't a series of attempted conspiracies. So, for instance, in 1810, during the Mexican War of Independence, the actual person who had basically declared independence with his grito, Miguel Hidalgo, declared in 1810 saying that Mexico would be free of slavery. It took them a while to actually implement this, Even though they gained independence in 1821, it wouldn't be until 1829 that they actually had abolition. And that abolition was actually pretty piecemeal. There was this whole concept in terms of abolition that it would be compensated abolition. Basically, the government would pay for your slaves to free them. This is how the British did it. This is how Mexico did it. This is how most countries actually did abolition. In fact, there's really two major countries that wouldn't do compensated abolition, and those are the United States and Haiti. One resorted to massacring the previous slave masters. The other one resorted to massacring the previous slave owners, or known as the Civil War. So it either ends by huge government expenditure or by violence. One or the other. Or, in another way, you have things like what happened in Russia, which kind of happened in Mexico as well, where they abolished slavery and basically just turned them into serfs. And that kind of happened in Mexico as well, where instead of having slavery, they would indenture the slaves. Obviously, that's not slavery, and they have certain inalienable rights at that point. But at the same time, it's basically just a switch from having no compensated labor to forever to no compensated labor for a select period of time. And that's actually how it would continue to function in Texas. That being said, slaves would conspire to escape to Mexico as a way of doing this. A major slave rebellion in Cherokee Nation happened because of people tried to escape to Mexico. Texas would ruin that, though. Then there were a bunch of religiously motivated conspiracies. A lot of them centering around Unitarians, or Quakers, who were very anti-slavery congregations. Well, the Quakers aren't Congregationalists, but sects, that's the word. And several of these conspiracies were found out, often executing the person conspiring to do it. But eventually that was always found out. But there was one that managed to move forward, and it was actually by a slave. That slave's name was Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a preacher. He was a slave, but also a preacher, because a way of maintaining the docility of your slaves was to convert them to Christianity. And don't get me wrong, there's probably plenty of slave owners that actually thought that they were doing their slaves a service or something along those lines, but you got to look at the system itself, right? But with all of these conspiracies happening in the North and feeding into the South, remember we had talked about in the last session how slavery steadily shifted southward, that Turner, who had actually openly written about how good it was to be a slave for a little bit, had somehow flipped on that in 1832. And in 1832, why are my notes? My notes are messed up. But in 1832, Nat Turner had been going from plantation to plantation in southern Virginia, specifically Southampton County, and he had specifically spoken to these different congregations of slaves about rising up. And he planned to do it specifically when there was a sign, and guess what? There was an eclipse. So that was the sign, and they started trying to go to, and they tried to gather up their forces, killing and slaughtering all white people that got in their way, or really that they just ran into. And tried to go to the county seat, which at that point was called Jerusalem. So kind of an ironic name there. They were quickly put down by militias, and the militias instead turned to massacring black people, free or not. And it turned into an orgy of violence. In fact, there's still a road in Southampton County that's called Blackhead Signpost Road. That's not a facetious name. So the U.S. Army actually had to go in to stop the violence. So the U.S. Army actually went in to stop all the lynching, because there was this orgy of violence. Arguable as to whether or not they really did anything, except for, because Nat Turner himself went on the run, they did manage to find him, and he kind of turned himself in. He was hiding in a hole, and a patrol just happened to be walking by, and he surrendered. That way. But, this was kind of the last straw in terms of slave rebellions, because now the South figured out that they needed to clamp down on even black literacy. And so at this point onward, most of the southern states would actually make it illegal for black people to read. And this was specifically to stop this kind of thing from happening again. Remember, the people there aren't seeing it with compassion. They're not looking at it as like, well, they're slaves, of course they're going to revolt. No, they're looking at the dead white people. One of the most publicized things was that there were a couple of babies thrown alive into a fire. And this, of course, made the rounds in the newspapers and that, so, people really freaked out. And so slave patrols were amped up, there was more money put into slave catching, and black literacy was eliminated. And so while on land, that's basically the last major slave revolt in American history, there would actually still be a number of shipboard slave revolts. And these shipboard slave revolts continued to happen throughout the period. For instance, there was one that they revolted, realized that the interior slave trade is still going on at this point. There's no transatlantic slave trade that's legal, but there's an interior one, which means that they would still ply the coast. And once the British allowed for abolition, one of the most successful ones was that they took over the ship while they were being transported to New Orleans around Florida and sailed it to Jamaica, where the British refused to allow them to be returned, effectively emancipating them. There were other ones that were not so lucky. For instance, there was one that while they did manage to escape, they crashed the ship into one of the Channel Islands that line the southern coast, and instead of becoming a maroon community, they decided to commit mass suicide rather than become enslaved. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff going on. There's also a couple of, because remember the illegal transatlantic slave trade is still going on. So for instance, there was a major slave revolt aboard a ship called the Amistad that was being transported by some Portuguese and Spanish sailors. And the slaves managed to kill the crew and sail it into the United States, where former President John Quincy Adams actually took up their case and managed to free them. They officially were free, but by simply revolting because the transatlantic slave trade was illegal. So there's still a lot of rebellions, but you can see that they're having to clamp further and further down to stop them, right? But that doesn't really change the trade itself, which continues and actually becomes more profitable over time. That's what is messed up on my notes. Okay, so obviously this fuels white fears. We talked a little bit about servile insurrections and the Haitian massacres. Haiti, once they had managed to gain their freedom from France, started actually supporting filibuster attempts elsewhere. So Simón Bolívar was one of the great liberators of South America from the Spanish, and he had very explicit support from Haiti. This, of course, freaked out Southerners who, had a very racialized view of South America as well. Despite, if you see paintings of Simón Bolívar, he looks pretty much like a white guy. They would call him a mongrel. Especially just simply for having done anything with Haiti. So there's all of this kind of stuff. Plus, when Bolivar manages to create Gran Colombia, he also creates a manumitting agency specifically to basically end slavery. So anyone who was born after 1821 was officially no longer a slave. So this is what's called gradual emancipation. That's how a lot of the northern states actually did it. And in fact, many northern states, because they had passed gradual emancipation, would still have slaves, despite being free states. There would still be many enslaved people within those states because it was gradual. For instance, one of the last slaves to be freed in the East was in New York. And most of the states actually had some sort of lingering effects of slavery, even if they were a free state. So when you see those kinds of parallels and Simón Bolívar working with Haiti, you can see there's some fear about servile insurrection. Especially when you have like Nat Turner and that, who are literally just killing any white people they run into. You have We already talked about Mexican abolition and Texas escape route. Man, my notes got really messed up. Let's see here. So, of course, with all of this, we had talked long ago about the rise of white supremacy in the United States. That it was actually pretty religiously motivated in the early colonies with the Great Awakening and that. And at the same time as all of this is happening, there is another Great Awakening happening, and that will be next week that we'll be talking about it. But keep in mind that converting a lot of slaves to Christianity, having a small free black population, kind of challenges the idea of white supremacy, because a lot of the Bible passages that actually talk about slavery speak specifically about not enslaving your kin. Well, you can't really argue that you can enslave non-Christians when they're Christians, and you're the one converting them. But the other thing that really scared people in terms of that kind of integration, because realize a lot of this is about trying to keep a specific color line. You know, the whole point of keeping slavery specifically colored, you know, that it is black people only, that it's really easy to separate them, right? If you have a multiracial slavery system, then it's not so easy to tell who is free and who is not. That was part of what happened with the German Coast Uprising, right? And so a lot of southern states started passing laws against what's called miscegenation. Miscegenation means race mixing, specifically marriage, copulation, anything along those lines, anything that's seen as crossing that border. So maintaining white supremacy became a key part of maintaining slavery. And so this was part of the entire system. Let me make sure that okay. So the slave system itself, well, you'll often hear it talked about being a bunch of rich people. Turns out that slaves actually weren't that expensive. This is a chart of what slaves generally cost in 2016 dollars. Notice they were cheaper than your phone generally. And these are for males specifically. Women actually sold for cheaper. This is of course averaged, but you can see how it was actually really easy to become part of the system. You know, you go to the slave auction, and you get yourself a slave. That's why so many small yeoman farmers actually had slaves. By 1860, approximately 32% of all Southern households owned slaves. 32%. And this is why. So this need to maintain white supremacy isn't just out of pure fear. It's also because it's really easy to cross that line because of how cheap the system is. Now, there's one thing you have to understand about calculating for inflation is that right at 1929, our ability to calculate for inflation just goes out the window. So this is very much an estimate. You could take those prices and double them and say it's the average too. But I think I'm getting the point across is that it's not as expensive as people make it out to be. So the only way that you maintain it Because remember, slaves can actually buy themselves out of the system, right? When they have that whole thing of having off hours during grow periods and that they could eventually build up enough money by working odd jobs to buy themselves out of the system. That's why there was also a steadily growing freed population, many of whom freed themselves simply by working those odd jobs. You'll notice on this chart that there's a drastic increase in price in the 1850s. That's because slavery suddenly became an issue in terms of expansion. And that happened almost perfectly where you see that spike begin in 1848. But that will be left for a couple weeks from now. So, in terms of maintaining white supremacy, there was basically a caste system created by this. Because one thing that helps to make sure that that you keep lower class white people in line is that they have somebody else to point to as being worse off. So black people were always set up to be worse off than white people, even if they were freed. This is really about class as well, right? That even if you are lower class, you have some class below you, and it's separated by a color line. That you can literally see it by the color of their skin. And this became so important in terms of maintaining white supremacy that even Abraham Lincoln in 1858 said, "There is a physical difference between the white and black races which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality." This is how ingrained white supremacy was, that if he were to speak out against it, he couldn't run as a candidate, even in Illinois. So there were kind of two different ways of maintaining this kind of white supremacy. The first was scientific racism. So a lot of the founding fathers actually helped to basically create scientific racism, especially with guys like Benjamin Rush, who actually said that black skin was a disease called Negroidism, that they were born white and turned black because of the disease. And Thomas Jefferson said in 1785, "I advance it therefore as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race, or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowment both of body and mind." One of the greatest ways that these people really reinforced this kind of pseudoscience was the invention of phrenology, which is basically just the measurement of skulls to say that certain skull shapes equal lower or inferior minds, because you have to maintain that that black people are inferior so that you can maintain the system of slavery and keep all of this distinction between white people and black people. You know, that's why why so many people were against miscegenation and that, right? This scientific racism actually is the foundation of a lot of biological sciences today. For instance, gynecology comes from experiments on slaves, specifically on their vaginas, and trying to say that black women and black men were more fertile and needed to be pushed down, not put down like killed, but pushed down, kept from multiplying too fast because they would otherwise overtake the white race. And remember, these people think that the white race is superior. So there's that way of maintaining white supremacy through very obvious racism. But then there's paternalism. And the idea of paternalism is that essentially you were guiding, slave owners were guiding their slaves to become more civilized, that they were savages and were in the process of being guided into true civilization. George Washington was a very prominent practitioner of this kind of paternalism. This is probably the most published stuff that you wouldn't find a lot of Southerners, especially after the 1830s, talking about scientific racism as the end-all be-all. They would normally supplement it between these two. So, for instance, George Washington, when he died in 1799, actually freed his slaves. He said that in his will that his wife, Martha Washington, had to free them during her lifetime. She wouldn't live that long, so they were freed fairly quickly. And in that will, he said, "The Negroes thus bound are, by their masters or mistresses, to be taught to read and write, and to be brought up to some useful occupation, agreeably to the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia, providing for the support of orphan and other poor children." He actually kind of set an example of how a paternalistic slave owner could continue to profit from their slaves and yet still come off looking like a better man by dying and saying that all the hardship of having to free your slaves gets pushed off after his death. But it also meant supplying the goods to keep those freemen educated and taken care of until they can provide for themselves. A lot of slave owners would actually implement those very same words into their own wills. So you can see that there's these two different conceptions of white supremacy. There's that paternalism, where, white people are superior to black people, but we need to, but black people can become equal given some arbitrary amount of time. Or you can have white supremacy that is dictated by biology. These two forces ultimately reinforced slavery. And of course, in order to maintain that system, there's a lot of violence, right? You have to, we talked last session about the whole carrot and stick approach. Well, this is how they're justifying it to themselves, how the slave owners are justifying it to themselves. But they still have to have that stick. And this ended up reverberating on Southern culture. In the South, even though in 1823 dueling was made officially illegal, although it had been illegal in a number of ways throughout many of the states, Southerners continued to practice it actually well after the Civil War. Dueling was just a way of life. Remember, Andrew Jackson was from Tennessee, and that he frequently engaged in duels. There's a possibility that he engaged in as many as 100. This is where the whole Southern good old boy trope comes from. It's that reverberation of having to portray one's masculinity and being able to say, I am the white man, while simultaneously using violence to suppress another race. This also pushed a form of femininity on the South, which is the cult of domesticity. Or as many women would call it, true womanhood, which was basically that standard idea of a Southern belle who is supposed to take care of their home. This was often in direct reaction to a lot of feminism that was growing out of the North. There was a huge push, especially after 1848, to have women get suffrage because of the Seneca Falls Convention up there. And in reaction to that, Southerners started publishing books about how Southern femininity didn't need the vote, didn't want the vote, because they were there to express true womanhood, to be the caregiver, and it's the men who were supposed to vote. So you can see this you have this masculinity and femininity being built on top of white supremacy. By 1846, where we will end this lecture and not talk about this subject until another couple of weeks, that whole thing with indentured servitude had all but disappeared. And because of this system, it made it really easy to keep slaves rather than indentures. So throughout from 1789 all the way to 1848, you saw this steady decline in indentures. Though in the North, that wasn't exactly the case. And because of all of this, Southerners needed to really protect this slaveocracy. Because this is an entire system, right? This is a caste system. You have the really wealthy slave owners, you have the medium and small ones, and then even white people who don't have slaves, that 68% of Southerners who don't have slaves are still part of this system because they are able to look at those inferior blacks as being inferior. And so the system reinforces itself. You can't even form cross ties between slaves and lower class whites because lower class whites see themselves as superior. And so this started being noticed by Northerners, and they called this slave power. In 1839, the Cincinnati Philanthropist, a newspaper that was very prominently anti-slave, said, "The events of the last 5 or 6 years leave no room for doubt that the slave power is now waging a deliberate and determined war against the liberties of the free states." This was because people were beginning to become more and more anti-slavery in the North. Remember, we talked about the North actually having its own slave system that just steadily moved southward as they no longer needed it. That it became much more easy to engage in wage labor rather than slavery. So there were a series of political compromises to kind of leverage that slave power, to make it so that that this aristocracy constituted and organized on the basis of the ownership of slaves, as a book in 1856 said, that there had to be a balance between the free and the slave states. This starts off pretty quickly with that Northwest Ordinance that we talked about a few weeks ago, where the Northwest Ordinance very prominently outlawed slavery in the territories. But states had the right to determine whether or not they wanted slavery. So even once for instance, Ohio, once it became a state, there was a huge push by Southerners to have it become a slave state. And this wasn't done by some sort of coercive means. It was simply a letter-writing campaign in favor of slavery and trying to convince Ohio voters to vote to have slavery. So they would, another way that is a little bit more underhanded is that slave owners would move into the Northwest Territory, and even though that would technically make their slaves free, they would sign articles of indenture with their slaves before moving into the territory, thereby making it legal for them to have slaves. But remember, technically, that makes them free. They're just indentured. But their goal, if slavery was made legal in these Northwest Territory states, once they became states, that these slave owners would be able to re-enslave them. Never worked out, but that was their hope. So this kind of culminated in the first of many compromises in 1790, when when there needed to be a balance struck between the North and South. And this compromise of 1790 basically said that the South could get Washington, D.C., could have the first federal district created by the U.S. Constitution, so long as the North maintained banks, maintained the national banking system. Remember, Andrew Jackson ended up destroying that, right? So the South really benefited ultimately. Although one could argue that the North benefited because, well, they're still the banking capital of the U.S. So even the placement of Washington, D.C. today was a compromise because of slavery. Though it was much more about maintaining a balance between the North and South. So we already talked about states' ability to vote for that stuff, but slavery very clearly concentrated into the South from 1790 onwards, as more and more states, northern states, passed emancipation. Though all of them would have some sort of gradual emancipation, because they didn't want to put the slave owners out for too much. It'd be too much of an inconvenience. This issue of the balance between free and slave states came to a head again in 1820 with the admission of Missouri, which would have severely off-balanced this free slave balance. And so in 1820, a series of compromise bills first split off Maine from Massachusetts, which was originally part of Massachusetts, and created it as a separate state, thereby rebalancing everything. But then, because Missouri is actually pretty far north compared to the other states around it, the other slave states around it, the other part of the compromise was that any further slave states would have to come from below the southern border of Missouri. So if you actually look at the northern tip of Texas today, the reason why it has that little panhandle from Oklahoma is specifically so that they could maintain the Missouri Compromise when admitting Texas. So that northern tip is actually kind of a scar left from slavery. And that weird, what was then called the neutral strip, a strip of no man's land that was technically not supposed to be anyone's except for the Osages, ended up being Oklahoma. So with all of this contention over the free state balance and the real compromise that the Missouri Compromise represented, that it kind of made a stable setup for how slavery would continue to expand and how free states would continue to expand. It set a clear delineating line that below this line is slavery, above this line is freedom, is free soil. It was time to clamp down and make sure that arguments in the Senate and in Congress would no longer cause these kinds of issues. And so in 1836, the House passed a resolution saying all petitions, memorials, resolutions, propositions, or papers relating in any way or to any extent whatsoever to the subject of slavery or the abolition of slavery shall, without being either printed or referred, be laid on the table, and no further action whatever shall be had thereon. So this is known as the gag rule, that essentially slavery as a topic within Congress was verboten. So this continued to reinforce the Missouri Compromise and set up a specific dynamic that would last until 1848. But of course, a lot of people had a problem with that, especially in the North. And so we saw the rise, especially in the 1830s, the rise of abolitionism. So there had been colonial efforts towards abolitionism. For instance, in 1688, the Germantown Quaker Petition Against Slavery was passed. Germantown is just north of Philadelphia. And 1688 is basically right around the founding of Pennsylvania colony. In 1735, Georgia had actually banned slavery, though they actually brought it back in 1751. So one of the first colonies to actually ban slavery was Georgia. But of course, they were founded as a military colony, so they didn't need slaves. They had penal laborers, people sent from England as prisoners to either work as laborers or to function for the defenses of Georgia against Spain. So you can see there's already a lot of compromises happening here. It's either oriented around religion or oriented around practicality. Practicality would be the reason why so many northern states would end up having gradual abolition, because it just simply wasn't necessary. but religion would continue to play a significant role. The first major society against slavery was the Pennsylvania Quakers, who founded in 1775 the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. Interestingly enough, led by Benjamin Franklin, who had actually been a slave owner himself early in life. But he started becoming more and more abolitionist. But this was very rare in the colonies, and even once the colonies became states, most of them passed abolition in ways that were to the benefit of slave owners, who would be compensated for the slaves that they would lose. Pennsylvania was the first to enact one of these things in 1780, which was an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And most of these gradual abolitions were compensated. But Massachusetts, interestingly enough, actually made it unconstitutional within their state to own slaves by a ruling of their courts. But that was extraordinarily rare. And it was basically a judicial ruling rather than any kind of actual act. So after the Compromise of 1820 and the gag rules, well, not even prior to the actual gag rules, but pretty much to keep the slave states from continuing to expand, because remember, the Missouri Compromise said they can expand so long as they are below this line. This started really angering folks, and this guy named William Lloyd Garrison started up a paper called The Liberator in 1831. He also created the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, which would become the primary organization for abolition. Now, Garrison was quite a strong speaker, and he was also a Unitarian trained as a preacher. So you can see the religion is continuing to inform this. But this is really the start of the abolitionist movement. All that other stuff prior to it was kind of local and fleeting. But Garrison wanted abolition now and everywhere in the United States. Not just in Pennsylvania, not just in the state, in any particular state, but throughout the country. That's part of why the gag rule was passed. And so the American Anti-Slavery Society actually ended up splintering into numerous other organizations over differences over whether or not abolition should be gradual, whether or not they should focus on the territories or anything along those lines. So several other organizations came about because of that, including the American Missionary Association in 1846, which would really blend religion back into it, not just as a moral cause, but reinforcing the whole thing about Christianity. Christians should not enslave Christians. So you can see there's a gradual buildup of abolitionism from the 1830s onward. What helped a lot of that is that now there were also freemen who were able to advocate on their own behalf, most notably Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass had actually freed himself by shipping himself to the north in a container. It worked. Didn't work so well for a guy out who managed to ship himself all the way to California from the South later on, where the Supreme Court had to get involved and said that, no, you're still a slave and you have to go back. But Frederick Douglass managed to escape. And he became a very strong advocate of immediate abolition, especially because he kept on publishing his own accounts of the thing. He was a very literate man and could write pretty well. In fact, I think that's one of the assigned readings, is a passage from him. Is a passage of his own recollection of being a slave, literally called My Life as a Slave. And so he had escaped to New York in 1838, and by 1845 he had released his autobiography. And in 1855 started theorizing about what it would mean to be free for all blacks after abolition. So now you've got the people, slaves themselves, or ex-slaves, speaking for themselves, doubly reinforcing this entire idea. And then a book called American Slavery as It Is came out. This was released in 1839, and as it was subtitled as The Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. It talked of all the brutality and barbarity of the system, really sensationalized every terrible thing that happened under slavery. In fact, a book that would come out later and really push a lot of sectionalism later was almost entirely based on accounts from this book. That book was a fiction book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which some folks, including Abraham Lincoln, would argue would be a key cause of the Civil War. With all of this rise of abolitionism, you have a rise of pro-slavery as well. Now, realize America had been pretty much pro-slavery the entire time, but now you have people advocating this kind of paternalism, with what like George Washington had been arguing that, but instead saying that that's a reason why slavery should expand, that slavery is good. A lot of Southerners up until that point viewed slavery as kind of a necessary evil, that it's the only way that they're going to make money, and that's how they put food on the table. And a lot of it, and all the fancy trinkets they can afford, and all of that kind of stuff, and entire mansions that take up thousands of acres, like George Washington's. But now you have an entire class of people who are arguing for slavery's expansion, and that the alternative was worse. They'd say that wage labor was particularly bad, and so they'd say that this is a way of fighting off socialism and the ravages of capitalism, that it's its own system and it's better. So this turned particularly violent in 1837 when they started attacking abolitionists. Elijah P. Lovejoy was mobbed in Illinois by citizens of Illinois and killed. He was basically lynched. In 1838, the Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia, also called the Temple of Free Discussion because it was a gathering place for abolitionists, was torched. And so you can see it's already starting to become a particularly nasty affair. And then, of course, you have fugitive slaves, because they're getting helped by people like Harriet Tubman, or even more flamboyantly, John Brown, who was a very, very militant abolitionist, and would frequently skirmish with Southern slave patrols. So, as we had talked earlier in the last session, abolitionism caused a lot of pro-slavery sentiment, which meant that there was a lot more money being funneled into enforcing the slave trade, the slave catchers, and so they had more guns and wealth to fight Northerners who were willing to fight them to try to free slaves. So one historian calls this the border war, as border states continued to fight over the expansion of slavery and fugitive slaves. So you can see that there's a lot of violence going on. So people looked to a way to try to off-gas all of this, some sort of release valve. And so they looked back to Africa. The creation of Sierra Leone by the British in 1787 offered an ideal of where freemen could be sent to have some sort of new life. And so the Back to Africa movement was seen as a fairly altruistic endeavor. By 1830 in the U.S., there were over 300,000 freemen. 300,000. Actually, some of whom ended up participating in slavery themselves. And so in 1816, the American Colonization Society was founded by Robert Finley. Though, oddly enough, it was actually typically led by Southerners, and the basic idea is that there would be a series of pieces of land grants in Africa that would allow for all of these freemen to go and live their own lives back in Africa. In fact, you can see here in the background, that's a map of all the different grants. This was mostly done on a state-by-state basis. That's why if you look closely, you can see that there's a few of them that are just like named Maryland and whatnot, because that was Maryland's strip of land. But as this became, this was kind of a difficult endeavor. In 1820, the first ships of freemen were sent with 88 freemen. They just showed up and purchased land, creating Monrovia, which named after the president, and the current capital of Liberia is Monrovia today. Because of this, Liberia is pretty much all of this land today. And so the endeavor expanded. With, like, for instance, the colony of Maryland was created in 1834, and so on and so forth. And the U.S. Navy would actually intervene in local affairs quite often, specifically to support the African Americans who had been transported back, or should we say American Africans? But the Americans who were there. So the U.S. Navy was actually an integral part of this entire system. And they would actually continue to rule over Liberia well into the 20th century. So this was a huge system, but you can see there's some problems with it, right? for instance, as early as 1817, many black abolitionists started to openly oppose it, saying that this was no better than Indian removal. In 1835, Gerrit Smith said, "The society is now, and has been for some time, far more interested in the question of slavery than in the work of colonization, in the demolition of the anti-slavery society than in the building of its colony." Essentially, they were trying, a lot of Southerners were using this as a way to answer abolitionism. So, this is a huge and complex topic, as you can see. How much time we got? We've got about 5 minutes. And a lot of it is based on religion, which is actually what we'll be talking about next time with the Great Awakening. But what about, because obviously Southerners are pretty religious themselves, right? Why is there this divide forming in religion? Why does religion keep on coming up? Specifically Quakers and Unitarians, right? We talked about them during the first Great Awakening. Why does it matter whether or not Nat Turner was a preacher? Why does it matter about these conspiracies, these anti-slavery conspiracies, and especially the fact that they were all ran by religion?
It's sort of contradictory to the religion's ideologies.
In some ways, though, if you read the Bible, there's plenty of mentions of slavery, and most of them are pro. There's a bunch of rules in Leviticus, for instance, that specifically state how you're supposed to treat your slaves. So, slavery is not something that Christianity itself opposes, at least according to its book. What does religion do, generally, in terms of societal level issues?
It kind of provides the moral standing that they want people to choose, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, it provides rules, right? It provides morals. It provides a system of understanding one's place. It's a way of projecting power. So, by doing so, you can see an argument already forming in religion that there's this northern interpretation of the good book and a southern interpretation. And we'll see that many religions would actually split over this. For instance, there's still such a thing as Southern Baptists today. Southern Baptists formed specifically because Northern Baptists were anti-slavery. So Southern Baptists were formed specifically as a pro-slavery religion. Actually, a lot of these splits, the Presbyterians would as well, though they would reform in the 1930s, I think. But a lot of religions would split, and specifically over what we will be talking about next week. So I think we don't have any time left. Yeah. So have a good day.